Good afternoon, everyone watching online here in the Philippines and worldwide. Welcome to the Public Sector Productivity Webisodes. My name is Gerard Calambro, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon. And let me introduce my co-moderator, Mr. Enzo Erenieta. Good afternoon, Sir Enzo.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. We would like to give a shout out to the following participating agencies, namely National Treasury, City Government of Tanauan, Batangas, PSA Central Office, DBM Region 10, PNP Iloilo, Office of the Ombudsman, Quezon City, DSWD Central Office, National Irrigation Administration Region 5, MMDA Makati City, Maritime Industry Authority, DALG Quezon City Civil Service Commission, and many more.
So here at the Development Academy of the Philippines, we believe that we play a vital role in nation building by helping accelerate the transformation of people and organizations for nation building. As an effort to stay relevant, we are conducting this webinar series on knowledge management to serve as a venue for learning the different tools and frameworks that contribute to policy and program formulation.
So, our speaker is the Supervising Fellow and Professor of Knowledge Management and Quality Management of the Graduate School of Public and Development Management. He is a resource person of the Productivity and Development Center and the Center of Excellence on Public Sector Productivity of the Development Academy of the Philippines. He is also a certified business mentor, coach, and technical expert of the Department of Trade and Industry and Philippine Center for Entrepreneurship. He also does consulting, training, and research work for various business organizations, government institutions, nonprofit organizations, and professional associations. And he is also a postgraduate and higher education professor at several colleges and universities like the University of the Philippines. His fields of expertise are knowledge management and organizational learning, ISO management systems, quality management and business processes management, performance management, organization development and design, innovation management, change management, evidence based management, entrepreneurship and startup business management, educational management and instructional design and technology, project management, and systems thinking. Let us all welcome Professor John Del Rosario.
Good afternoon, Sir John. Take it away, sir.
So, good afternoon, Gerard, and good afternoon, Enzo, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm glad to be here and to be with you, okay, for the next hour as we learn about knowledge management, okay. And though it's a very lazy afternoon, but I appreciate very much that you are taking the time out to learn from what we're going to be discussing today. This particular webinar actually comes in three parts. Okay, so this is the first segment. It's an introduction to understanding what knowledge management is, and we're still going to have a second session tomorrow, and then a third one on Friday. But for this particular segment, it is about the principles and processes of knowledge management as applied in the public sector. So we want to learn knowledge management as practiced in the public sector. First things first, although it's a very simple question, but we have to get it out of the way to be able to be on the same page kung anong understanding natin about knowledge. Okay, so what is knowledge? It's about human or organizational asset enabling effective decisions and actions in context. It's the only standard, international standard on knowledge management in ISO 30401, the 2018 version. It's found in specifically section 3.25. It's nice to use this particular definition because it's too direct to be able to understand what knowledge really means. So there's a recognition on the part of ISO that knowledge can be thought of as both human, okay, meaning later on we're going to clarify the term tacit knowledge. So the knowledge comes from the minds of people, but also you have to look into the knowledge that is found in the organization, or what we call organizational asset. But of course, we're not going to be interested with any type of knowledge. We're interested with knowledge that is useful in the sense that this knowledge can be used as inputs to making effective decisions and actions. Okay, whatever we need to decide on, whatever we need to take action from, we can look at knowledge in that manner. Okay? So, very purposive ang knowledge. Okay? We're acquiring knowledge, we're learning knowledge, ganyan, because we need to come up with effective decisions and actions. Knowledge can be interpreted as something by way of an intellectual capital, because that's another term related to what we know about knowledge, intellectual capital. But in intellectual capital, it's a lot broader in the sense that you take a look at three domains or three aspects, namely human, relationship, and organizational. Okay, so we already touched on human and organizational earlier when we look at the definition given by ISO, because we said that ISO said knowledge is both human and organizational in nature. Right smack in between the human aspect and the organizational aspects of knowledge is relationship. It's very intangible in the sense that knowledge exists when people interact with each other. So even with the mere interaction between people, you can create knowledge out of it. Okay, there's knowledge to be learned, there's knowledge to be shared. So I believe that intellectual capital is a bigger term than knowledge. So we have to connect the idea about knowledge with intellectual capital. And by looking at this, we can see that knowledge can be found, as mentioned earlier, that people, individual, that knowledge that resides in their head, and then the work unit and organizational. We need to also clarify the difference among the three, because we cannot assume that if knowledge is found at the organizational level, at the work unit level, in that same organization, and individuals from that organization will share the same knowledge, or vice versa. I mean, certain people with certain knowledge would be able to share that knowledge to their work unit or to the entire organization. So if we really want to be strict about how we look at knowledge in our organization, we look at the knowledge itself, which exists in these three different levels. The bottom line with regard to knowledge is its connection to value creation. We have to remind ourselves that knowledge is just a tool. It's not an end in itself, meaning it's not just a matter of acquiring knowledge, having the knowledge. If you don't apply that knowledge, it's worthless, it's pointless. So when you apply that knowledge, it creates value to you, to your organization, to whatever you do. In many organizations, knowledge is seen as something by way of knowledge resources. What organizations have or need to have. Organizations having the knowledge, they can look at this knowledge as one of their resources, together with the physical resources, with the financial resources, technological knowledge, technological resources, so on and so forth. We already mentioned this, that knowledge can be taken as the intellectual capital, how organizations apply or use their knowledge resources. I indicated here that it becomes knowledge asset when you apply those resources and they provide value to your organization, they become assets to the organization. There can also be valuation of knowledge for your organization, because you applied whatever knowledge that your organization has, and your organization benefits from the application of that knowledge. Basically, the idea is from intellectual capital to intellectual property, especially if you introduce the concept of innovation. Every now and then, we know that organizations have to innovate. So once they do that, certain innovations may be patentable. It can move from innovations to patents. So your concept of intellectual capital becomes intellectual property. So in some organizations, especially in the private sector, they create research and development units or departments. For them, that is so crucial in their operations, because the role of that particular work unit is to create new knowledge and apply that particular knowledge in terms of what the organization does. To further explain the value of knowledge to organizations, it starts with stakeholder needs. Any organization, all organizations for that matter, have stakeholders. You start there. These are the customers. In ISO parlance, the term is interested parties. These are the stakeholders that you need to serve. So you need to take care of, you need to know what their needs are. And based on those particular needs, that's what you incorporate in the strategic thrust of your organization, going down to the operations. And then in order for that operations to operate, so to speak, you need to identify the performance competencies and organizational capabilities, which produce certain results and evidence. And then finally, it should result to satisfaction of stakeholder needs. So knowledge here comes in performance, competencies, and organizational capabilities. The individuals for the organization, the different work units, cannot have the competencies, the capabilities that they need if they don't have the knowledge that are used to make themselves competent or capable. We expect the people who work for organizations to have the knowledge that is needed in the competencies, in the capabilities of the organization. To further elucidate what I'm trying to say here, here are examples of knowledge. You can take a look at facts and truths, or the semantics, or the meanings behind what the information, the report is saying. Okay, the ideas and concepts, especially when you do brainstorming, the experiences over the years that you gather, and then the inferences, the analysis and synthesis that you can derive from reading reports, reading the research studies. And then many theories and frameworks and models are based on knowledge. They just come together in a particular framework. That's why they're called theories, frameworks, and models. So that's also a representation of knowledge. If you go into paradigms, beliefs, values, perspectives, and opinions, that's another area of knowledge. And then the intuition, the insights, like when you're thinking about certain things, you are deciding on something, and then the answer, the ideas just dawn upon you. Okay, that's also considered knowledge, although there's no systematic explanation why it happened. But still, it's considered knowledge because the insights, the intuition comes from your mind. Okay, and then when you make judgments and based on your expertise, you do evaluation. So that's also an example of knowledge. And finally, when you create something, you cannot create something without knowledge. So creations are considered knowledge. We come down to this. We said that knowledge is just a tool. So it has to be applied to work. So when you apply it to work, the work becomes knowledge work. Okay. So when you say that, that means the knowledge is reflected in the job roles, responsibilities, and authorities that require subject matter knowledge, thinking, and use of mental or cognitive faculties or abilities. Plain and simple. Let me remove the complication. When you say knowledge work, it's something cognitive, right? It's something that you think about, right? You use your head. It doesn't have to involve deep analysis or something, but it's compared to manual work, routinary work, repetitive work. Although for repetitive work, there's still knowledge involved, of course, at the start, but it becomes habitual, it becomes automatic that you don't think about it anymore. So knowledge work is more on you do a lot of thinking before doing the work. Okay, so work results with measurable or identifiable evidence. That's the thing about knowledge work. There's no way to measure knowledge work if the knowledge work cannot produce certain results. So you rely on the results as a way to measure, as a way to evaluate knowledge work. That's the only thing, as opposed to manual work, physical work, wherein you can just observe the person doing the work, right? But for intellectual work, for knowledge work, there has to be some results that you're looking at the end to be able to find out if it's really knowledge work. That's very important nowadays because I've been asked many times that what do we do with work from home? In the first place, the job has to be knowledge work. You cannot do it from home if it's not knowledge work. If it's something physical, something manual, like cooking burgers or something, of course you cannot do that. But with working from home, the work has to be knowledge work. That's the only way that you can make work from home here. There's a certain level of trust that you need to provide to your employees, if you happen to be the boss, to make sure that a work from home works. Otherwise, if you don't really trust your employees, there's always a need on your part to supervise, to check every now and then. And that's so difficult with working from home. To be able to understand which work should be taken at home, much like even before the pandemic. I mean, if you really need to bring work home, still that work should be knowledge work. It's just that working from home becomes the fad. Okay, it becomes the trend now because of the pandemic, right? But in reality, some of us may be doing this even before the pandemic. So what is knowledge management? I guess that's the bottom line concern. After understanding what knowledge is, now we're ready to manage it. And if we take a look at it, I define it as managing the environment and the organizational or institutional and individual or personal processes that assure the application or use of knowledge produces the results that provide value for stakeholders. It's very evident from the definition that you don't directly manage knowledge. technically knowledge is used by each individual. The way the person uses that knowledge depends on the person. What the organization can do by way of managing it is managing the environment where it is applied, where it is shared. That's why if you look at literatures, the two important concerns of knowledge management is knowledge sharing and knowledge use or application. We want people to share knowledge and we want people to apply or use this knowledge, right? Because we said that knowledge is just a tool and you only realize the value of knowledge when you apply it. We want to encourage knowledge sharing because there's learning in it, right? Once you start sharing knowledge, people learn from each other. And besides, knowledge grows with the sharing. But the actual sharing, the actual use of this particular knowledge that we're talking about cannot be directly managed by the organization. What the organization can do is just look into the environment where the sharing, where the using of knowledge happens. Because for me, knowledge management also constitutes of organizational or institutional and individual or personal processes. I notice this when I do my KM consulting. Many other consultants just focus on the organizational or institutional processes. They're being hired by the organization and then it's about the organization. So whatever processes we need to establish to make sure that knowledge management works for us. That's the natural logic to it, natural interpretation. But for knowledge management to work in your organization, it has to go down to the individual or personal processes. As we're saying that we cannot directly manage knowledge because individual or personal component. Okay? Unless you cannot dictate people how they use, how they share knowledge. You can just encourage them, you can provide incentives, so on and so forth. But it's still up to them how they share knowledge, how they use knowledge. Later on, you will find out that there are similarities between the two sets of processes, but there's a difference between the two. Here are some examples. The KMS, or the Knowledge Management System. With the advent of ISO 30401-2018, the newest version of ISO in knowledge management, or the only version, the scope of what we know as KMS or knowledge management system becomes wider. It becomes more organization-wide. Before ISO 30401, I often hear that organizations believe that they have a knowledge management system because they have a working information system. So may database sila. And for them, that's KMS. But of course, as we learn from ISO 30401, there's more to it. And as we're going to be learning by tomorrow. Another example is organizational memory system, OMS. So with regard to organizational memory system, perhaps this is the one some organizations are referring to when they say their information system is their KMS. Because in the organizational memory system, what is stored in the IS, in the database, in the portal, in the repository of the organization, that's what they call their KMS. But in reality, it's just the organizational memory system, or OMS. Okay, we'll explain that later. And then knowledge maps, some examples, the expert directories, okay, both in and out of the organization. And then there's what we call the transactive memory system, who knows what. And then service level agreement, I think you're familiar with it, SLA. You have job rotation. You know what? Even the simple job rotation, moving people around, it's a very effective way to do knowledge management. Each and every one of us really takes the job rotation seriously. Okay? They really learn from the job. Usually, for many private companies, that's the way to train a general manager, to promote a general manager, to prepare the general manager for the future position. Okay, they go around in each position to learn them. The most popular communities of practice, it's a voluntary group discussing certain issues, certain concepts, certain problems, certain topics. And then benchmarking, which I think you're very familiar with, is also a form of KM. And then we have knowledge database, repositories, and portals. That's the usual idea about KM, having these repositories, databases, and portals. You can also use quality circles. So quality circle is also a way, for as long as everything is documented, the work being done by the quality circles, it can be considered KM, because obviously other quality circles, other work units from the organization can learn from whatever is documented in those quality circles. And then if you do action research, that's also an idea, because in action research, you study the situation and then apply what you studied and then make improvements, revisions based on the application of what you've learned. So it's very iterative. So there's a lot of learning doing action research. And finally, R&D. That's the classic KM, the research and development. Of course, with research and development, there's a tendency for knowledge to just start and reside from that R&D unit. But we know that knowledge can come from anyone. This is the reason why I always get ideas that they like the idea of putting up a KM department, a KM unit. My take on that is that for as long as knowledge, it doesn't become a monopoly of the KM unit or the KM department, then you may do so. Because there's a tendency for people to think of, yeah, when we talk about knowledge, when we talk about knowledge management, it should be the responsibility of that particular unit. So it discourages other people or to not even bother with knowledge management when knowledge management should be organization-wide. So why KM? Why are we studying this? Why are we learning from the field, from the practice? Most, if not all, work in organizations are knowledge-abled. They may not be that knowledge-based, but they are knowledge-abled. Kasi paano gagawin yung work kung talagang wala namang knowledge yung nagtatrabaho dun sa job, right? And the jobs are supposed to contribute to the overall mission, mandate of the organization, of the agency. So since they are contributing to the entire organization, we expect this particular work to be knowledge-abled. People bring in, share, use, and leave with knowledge. That's another thing. If you believe in that, then you have to do KM. You hire people who are competent, and since they are competent, that means they have some knowledge. So you can learn from that knowledge. You can use that knowledge in the organization, whatever the knowledge that these people bring. They share knowledge when they finally start working for your organization. So you also need to, if you want to learn from this sharing of knowledge, then you have to document this knowledge, the sharing of knowledge. Okay? Even the use of knowledge. The use is very fleeting if you don't document it. So it has to be captured with the use of knowledge. And finally, it's about knowledge retention. Because when people leave the organization, they also bring their knowledge. That's why in ISO 9001:2015, there's a particular section on organizational knowledge. There's a recognition on the part of ISO that organizational knowledge is very important because they believe knowledge should be retained in the organization regardless of the turnover of the organization's personnel. And learning happens all the time in organizations. And if that happens, you need to manage that learning, right? Then you need to do KM. Here's a very popular model, okay, in knowledge management. This is what we call the Seki Model of knowledge conversion. It started by Ikojiro Nonaka, obviously Japanese siya, back in the 1990s. So according to him, knowledge goes through conversions via socialization, externalization, combination, and internalization. Okay? According to Nonaka, you can classify knowledge into two, either tacit knowledge or explicit knowledge. So the only difference between the two is that tacit knowledge is in the minds, is in the brains of everyone, each and every one of us. But any information, any details that are documented, that are recorded, they become explicit knowledge. So over time, these types of knowledge vary. So when tacit is converted to another tacit knowledge, okay, according to this model, it's what you call socialization. So an example would be casual conversations among employees while having lunch together, or maybe during meetings. They exchange information, they communicate with each other. So if that knowledge doesn't become recorded or documented, then it's just tacit knowledge to tacit knowledge. Or maybe casually you consulted your boss about a particular problem and you got the advice from your boss. Of course, this is not recorded. So the tacit knowledge of your boss was shared to you, and what you learned from that conversation becomes your own tacit knowledge. The other knowledge conversion is what we call externalization. This is the most popular knowledge conversion, wherein tacit knowledge is converted to explicit knowledge. So when you're working on a project, okay, so to be sure, at the end of the project, you'll be required to submit a project terminal report. So whatever you learn from the project, that's tacit knowledge, right? Initially, but since you're required to submit this report, whatever you learn becomes explicit knowledge. So in that way, it's getting to be externalized. In fact, this is the concern of many organizations. If you want knowledge to be retained, whatever tacit knowledge that is important to your organization should be converted to explicit so that it stays with the organization even if the person already leaves the organization. And there's what we call the combination from explicit to another explicit knowledge. If you're starting from like an operations manual, and then of course that's something explicit, right? Because it's written down. And then you use that operations manual to be able to schedule the work of your employees, which requires you to document that work schedule. So it's like explicit knowledge being converted to another explicit knowledge. And then internalization, this where learning really happens, okay, when you do internalization, because you start with something explicit, like reading a book. Whatever you learn from reading a book, reading a report, reading an analysis, reading a plan, okay, some studies, and you learn from it, it becomes part of your tacit knowledge. Nonanka here uses very simple concepts but very, very powerful. The application is, I think that's the what you call beauty of the model of Nonanka, because it's easily understandable. So when it's easily understandable, it's easily applied. So I guess that should be the case for knowledge management, so that people won't be scared of using knowledge management. During the time of APO with its KM framework, they came up with this particular idea, but this was like 10 years ago or something. But it's still very much relevant today. They're using this particular idea in terms of how to introduce KM to organizations. That's their concern here. Take a look at this. Okay, identify, create, store, share, and then apply. These are the concerns of knowledge management. And these are the factors or variables that you have to consider when making this particular framework work. I think it's a very comprehensive framework. Although there are a full-blown article on this, you can search it in the internet if you want to learn more about this framework. So we look at principles. What are the different principles? So here, these are not hard and fast principles. Actually, these principles, they're not found in literatures. I thought principles, even if they're called principles, should be practical enough for them to be applicable, right? So first, there's what we call principles on knowledge. Knowledge informs decisions, actions, performance, and practice of the organization and all its work units and individual members. We keep on saying that knowledge is just a tool. So people's prior knowledge factors into how they use, share, and manage knowledge, for as long as that prior knowledge is the correct knowledge, because there's going to be a lot of unlearning if that person's prior knowledge is the wrong knowledge, right? So knowledge makes people competent. That should be the idea. They're considered competent because they have the knowledge. If they don't have the knowledge, you can't say that they are competent, plain and simple. On people, only competent people are hired by the organization. Of course, why will you hire someone who's incompetent? By the mere term incompetent, do you want to be associated with someone who's incompetent, right? And you're the one who hired that incompetent person. Knowledge defines competent people's thinking and behavior and how they learn. We want people who are competent because obviously they can hit the ground running with us because they possess the knowledge, okay, and they're going to behave accordingly because they have the knowledge. What we say before now, we want professionals who has professional ethics, so on and so forth. Part of that reason is because the person has knowledge, the person is competent, right? And while that person works in the organization, they also learn. They easily learn with us in the organization. Okay, so people have their own individual or personal process of managing knowledge. This is one of the reasons why I said earlier that in KM there are two types of processes, for me at least: the organizational or institutional, and the individual or personal. Okay, I'll explain that later. On performance management in the organization is competency based. You're expected to hire people who are competent, but make sure that inside your organization, the performance management system in your organization is also competency based, meaning there's a recognition of the competencies of your people when you evaluate their performance or reward their performance. People's knowledge and competencies, which are manifested in their performance, are recognized and form the base of performance improvement, advancement, and rewards. There shouldn't be like politics involved in promoting people because they're based on. Yeah. So the idea about making your performance management competency based is you want your performance management system to be objective. I have a friend from the Civil Service Commission. She said to me that that's what they're driving at ever since. They really want the each and every agency to have a competency-based performance management system to make it objective so that it's not a matter of politics when you promote people, when you give rewards to people, when you evaluate their performance. But of course, when you talk about SPMS, PBB, the whole system broke down. How people use, share, and manage their knowledge is integrated into their job description and performance evaluation. That's another thing. I've been often asked, how do we really make KM work in our organization and to make it really permanent? I said, aside from making sure that your performance management system is competency based, the use of knowledge, the way you share knowledge or whatsoever, should also be incorporated in the way people's performance is managed in your organization. Better yet, if you can include that as part of their job description. On technology, technology is a tool for managing knowledge. It's a lot easier to manage knowledge with technology. Technology is designed to knowledge management. If that is not the case, it's a problem. Many times I've been asked also that, can we just use our existing information system? I always tell them, for as long as the functions that you want to assign to your knowledge management or the things that you want to do with knowledge management can be covered, can be performed by your existing information system. More often than not, it's not. Knowledge management technologies are user friendly in the true sense of the word. People are going to shy from or resist using knowledge management if they find it unwieldy, they find it very complicated. So we don't want to add to the burden of the people working in your organization. That's why we want to make it as seamless as possible in terms of using knowledge management. Knowledge management technologies are designed to work processes and jobs so that if you integrate the use of those technologies related to KM as they do their work, as they perform their job, they'll be forced to do KM in a way. If they are still resisting the use of KM, they'll be forced to use KM because it's already integrated in the way they do their work. Technology integration into knowledge management should be subjected to cost benefit analysis. Of course, technology is expensive. If it doesn't justify the benefit you're going to get from it, forget about it. Because knowledge management doesn't have to be technology based. That's very clear. But at the start, I said technology is a tool for managing knowledge, right? So knowledge management is a lot easier if you use technology. But if it doesn't, if the costs do not justify the benefits that you can get from using such technology, then forget about it. So you do CBA or cost benefit analysis. On evidence of results, knowledge is only good as its results because we said knowledge is not an end in itself. It's just a tool. So the only way to verify if knowledge is good for us, the knowledge is providing the value to us, then we have to see its translation to results. Results are the evidence of knowledge that is useful and provides value to the organization and its work units and individual members. Results from the learning, use, application, and continual improvement of knowledge are measured and evaluated. Performance is defined in terms of knowledge, competencies, and results. Plain and simple. Knowledge is just a tool, and knowledge is used as an input to our decisions, to our actions. If these actions and decisions result to good things, better things, improvements, then that knowledge is good. That's the only way that we can say that knowledge is really useful. That knowledge is really useful to us. So we cannot say knowledge in general, right? So as I said, you have to really select which particular knowledge you're going to be using, depends on the situation. On learning, knowledge is created and are acquired, captured, used or applied, shared, and continually improved through learning. That's why the knowledge management field is very closely associated to organizational learning, or OL. In fact, we recently launched the newest master's program at the DAP. It's what we call the Master in Public Management, Major in Knowledge Management. There you go. Okay, it's going to be offered at the graduate school here at DAP. Okay, and yeah, we're going to start with the first batch this year. And one of the subjects there is organizational learning, in recognition that organizational learning is so important to knowledge management. People want and need to learn, especially what they're going to be learning is going to be useful to them. It's going to help them in their job. Okay? Learning is motivated by the use of or application of that learning, as opposed to children, I guess, wherein we just impose on them, especially the teachers, what they need to learn. It's like they're saying that it's spoon feeding or something. But once you become an adult and you talk about learning, it's all about being motivated to learn. And being motivated to learn, to get that motivation, is making sure that learning can be applicable to what the person is doing. Otherwise, it's pointless, it's senseless of learning. Just like this particular training, if it's not useful to you, then what's the point of boring yourself with me? Although it's just a 1 hour thing, but there has to be some motivation, right? Learning is manifested in behavioral change or change in a person's thinking. That's how we can define what learning is. There's a change in that person, and knowledge does that. On change, lessons learned change the way organizations, work units, and individuals do their work. Change is the result of learning. Change is progressive, of course, and change is more acceptable with knowledge. Okay, because change, it's a relative term. Some people like change, some people don't like change. But when you attach knowledge to that change, it becomes objective. Because I believe that people won't acquire knowledge, won't do some learning if that knowledge won't help them. I mean, it won't assist them. It's just a waste of time. Just like with reading books or whatever you do, you attend training programs. All these things should help you in whatever you do, you want to do. So change, to make it objective, really has to be connected to knowledge. On innovation, in our program, the MPMKM, we also have a specific subject on innovation management. So that's another subject. Aside from organizational learning, we have innovation management. Organizations need to innovate every now and then. Not every time, but every now and then, if there's a need to. You don't force innovation. It just happens, right? Okay. Innovation should be a formal, deliberate, and disciplined process in organizations. That's why ISO also came up with this sets of standards on innovation management system, particularly ISO 56002 2019. So there's a systemic way of putting up your innovation management system. So innovation starts and ends with knowledge, right? You cannot innovate if you don't have the knowledge. First things first, there has to be knowledge. But these are the subjects, organizational learning and then innovation management, of course. And also we have a subject or course on performance management, on the context, because knowledge is just a tool. It's a matter of how you apply it. So you have to consider the context of where you're applying that knowledge. The context of the organization, both external and internal, affects knowledge management, and knowledge management in turn affects the context of the organization. So vice versa. Fit in knowledge management is defined in terms of how knowledge management satisfies the needs of the organization as derived from the organization's context. Context changes over time and space. It's usually the start of any KM initiative, KM program. You start with the context of the organization. Each organization has its own context. That's why you have to start there, both the internal and the external context of that organization. And based on that context analysis, you should be able to identify the knowledge needs of your organization. And those are the pieces of knowledge that you have to focus on because they are derived from the context of your organization. On management, system thinking is used to manage knowledge in organizations. That's why it's the overall framework of the curriculum of MPMKM. Knowledge management is both systemic and systematic. Knowledge is managed at the, as we already mentioned this, organizational, work unit, individual, job levels. Knowledge management consists of both organizational or institutional and individual or personal processes. That's why we're saying that there are two sets of KM processes. Here's the organizational version, scanning and audit, identification, selection, acquisition or creation, capture, storage, access and retention, transfer and collaboration, use or application, monitoring, reporting, and documentation, and then review and feedback, and then we have measurement and evaluation, and then institutionalization, and then recognition and discipline, and then finally continual improvement or purging. If we want certain knowledge to be retained in the organization, we also want certain knowledge to be purged, to be removed from, to be disposed, to be eliminated from our system, from our organization. The individual processes are scanning and sensing, identification and selection, acquisition or creation, or what we call learning, the same thing as reflection and internalization, that's also learning, use or application, externalization and integration, and then sharing and validation or revision, again measuring retention and updating or purging. Okay, so there are two sets, and I said earlier that many organizations only focus on the organizational because that's what they feel they can do, but somehow even if the organization cannot directly manage knowledge, they also have to look into the personal processes involved in using KM, in doing KM. Because in order for the organizational processes to be effective, those processes have to go down to the personal level. Okay, so that's the logic of idea of having two sets of KM processes. We'll further discuss this by tomorrow. So same time, of course, 2 o'clock. Okay, for the part two. Because when you talk about process, we talk about the practice of knowledge management. Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Sir John, for your very wonderful and informative lecture on knowledge management. So this is just an introductory session today. All right. So Sir Enzo will start with the question and answer portion. Can you read the first question, sir?
Okay, so our first question comes from Rodolfo and Cabo, DSWD, DRMG. They say, "Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. Is attitude and or character of human capital plays essential component in the realm of knowledge and value creation?"
Hi, Rodolfo. That's a very good question. Before, if the focus is just on the organizational, institutional processes, the traditional way to do KM, what I noticed in some organizations, quickly you can say that it has no room. But we're looking at the individual, the personal processes. And once those processes come in, then you have to focus on motivation, we focus about character, personality, attitude. So that's why I believe that although KM becomes messier when you go into that level, individual or personal, but it's more effective because at the end of the day, knowledge is produced by people and used by people. And whether you like it or not, people have emotions. That's why there are already studies, articles about emotional intelligence on knowledge management. Definitely, it plays a role right now. That's why it's not that easy to apply knowledge management at the personal level. But it has to be done. It's painful, but that's the idea. Because the benefits are better, are greater with that pain. So yeah, because people react differently. I don't know. However much I say that knowledge is something objective, you only look at knowledge that is useful to you, so on and so forth. Still, there's the it's used. This knowledge is useful to me, but it came from him. What do you call that? So I hate him. How about the knowledge? I just hate him. So it's a character thing, but you have to consider that the knowledge is important because of the relationship between those two people. The knowledge is not used. So, however you want them to be objective, we also want to say that. We always say that, right? People should be objective, but in reality, we are not. We are so emotional.
Okay, sir. I'll proceed to the next question.
Sige.
This one comes from Jomar Sahona, Philippine Normal University. Their question is, can knowledge be transferred or diffused?
Yeah, definitely. Medyo mabilis lang, no? Kasi mabilis lang yung when I flash the organizational, institutional, and the personal and individual process. But we're going to provide more details tomorrow. But anyway, both at the organizational, institutional, and the personal, individual, there are two components there which concern transfer of knowledge. In fact, what we know about knowledge sharing is more personal in nature. People share knowledge, they talk to each other casually. That's already transferring knowledge, right? So it's just a matter of, do you document, do you record that conversation, right? At the institutional level, of course, when you submit reports, the moment you submit reports, that's already submit reports to your boss. That's already transfer of knowledge, right? Or you send memorandum circulars to many people. So yeah, definitely, Jomar.
Okay.
All right, sir. So, in relation to that, the next question is from Marilyn Custodio.
Okay.
So there are some employees that do not want to share what they learned because they have learned it themselves during self-study. How do we deal with these kinds of situations? For example, if a person or a colleague doesn't want to share the knowledge because it was his own or her efforts that he learned this skill or knowledge. So how do we make them share this knowledge, and how can we create a system wherein we can capture this kind of knowledge?
That's the problem, Marilyn.
From Marilyn.
That's the problem. That's why we have to go down at the personal individual level, because sharing is something personal. I can only share what I want to share. Like perhaps I'm sharing something, but it's not complete. I'm only giving the surface knowledge, right? I didn't go deep into what I shared to you. So, but unless you already know what I know, then you will never know if I shared everything. On the part of on the part of the person not wanting to share, what are you going to do with your knowledge if you're not going to be sharing it? What's the point? Where Because the problem with knowledge, you don't get rewarded, recognized if you don't share knowledge and apply that knowledge to your organization, and the application helps your organization. I don't get that. But just to institutionalize it, I said that knowledge management should be incorporated in the performance management of the organization. So, in other words, if you can include the actual sharing of knowledge and use of the shared knowledge in the job description and in the performance evaluation, people will be forced to share. Like, okay, how many knowledge that you shared in the previous year, and what happened to this sharing of knowledge? Was that knowledge used? That's why one very good tool in knowledge management is expert directory, both internal and external. Especially internal, that's very good, because with that, you don't really have to publish what you know, but there's a recognition that, okay, this person knows about these things. So if you have questions, go to him, go to her. At least people know where to go, because if it's too costly, you have to do research on your own, and do something when the knowledge is already in house. And besides, I don't know, ever since I started with knowledge management, or even without knowledge management yet, I've been sharing knowledge. I don't know why do you have to. It doesn't diminish. The law of diminishing return doesn't apply to knowledge. The economics law of diminishing return, it doesn't apply to knowledge. In fact, knowledge grows as you keep on sharing that knowledge, because it gets to be combined with other knowledge. Right? And for me, the best argument there is that, what's the point of having the knowledge if you're the only person who knows that knowledge, right? Because knowledge needs to be applied. And once you
Yes.
start applying it, people will know that knowledge. So give recognition, incentives, so it should be part of the performance evaluation, performance management.
So thank you very much for that suggestion. So another question is from Virgilio Cinco. In the realm of knowledge management, this is related to some government agencies or private organizations as
Yeah.
well. What activities do you suggest in an organization with two different generations? So more or less, some of the employees there are from the younger generation, some are from the older generation. So there might be a generation gap, and some of the key differences would be how do they get the information, or how do they share their information. So what do you suggest, sir, to do in order for them to be more aligned with each other because they come from different backgrounds, sir?
Before I did this consulting with IBM, we used the buddy system. We partner a young one with an old one. Bala na sila kung sino yung old, sino yung young, no? So they become buddies, they become partners, so they should be sharing knowledge with each other. But I think it should be more than that. We have to be clear why in the first place they don't want to share knowledge with each other? Is it because of the generation gap? I don't know. And who's the one? And which generation doesn't want to share the knowledge? Is it the younger or the older? Usually, and supposedly the older are the ones who uh, are long there in the organization, so they should be the ones sharing. And usually, old people want to talk, want to share, right? The question there is more on the younger generation. Do they want to listen? So I don't know who's asking the information there, who's asking for knowledge, right? But better if it's one on one. We introduce the buddy system at IBM.
Thank you. We have one last question from Ms. Sharice May Pisa.
Mm,
So, how do you encourage a culture of lifetime learning in the
mm,
organization, especially if the older generation employees prefer not to grab the opportunities, no, yung like training?
mm. Well, about the training, usually people have a reason of not wanting to attend the training. But if the training is really relevant to what they do, they should be able to be motivated to attend such training. Okay, but uh, if you want to have a more comprehensive discussion on that, you know what, the ISO 30401 2018, they came up with a whole annex on knowledge management culture, and it's a very good. There's so many insights, but again, we go back to the performance management system. It's always the case with people to ask the question, "What's in it for us? What are we going to get out of this? Why am I going to waste my time with this?" And usually, if you incorporate whatever initiative you have, not just for KM, but for other initiatives in the performance management system, it gives them the reason to be able to embrace the idea. And I think that the resistance with regard to learning is that if it's really KM, because learning becomes KM if you start documenting, recording the learning. And that's the hard part. Can you just imagine you have a diary of learning? Anyway, nowadays who still makes diaries, right? Writes diaries. So and here you're talking about learning. What I learned today, that I should not talk to my boss every Thursday. Oh, why? Because he's always absent on Thursday. No, but what I'm saying, what I'm saying is, that's the thing about learning. Because learning is pointless in KN if it doesn't record, if it doesn't get recorded, if it doesn't get documented. It's just learning, just like in school.
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
So, I guess that's our last question. Thank you very much, Sir Del Rosario, for
Yes. Yes,
introducing the
Michael.
concept of knowledge management in the public sector in this afternoon session.
All right, thank you very much, Sir Enzo. And of course, on behalf of the Academy, I would like to thank everyone for watching this afternoon. And I hope you learned a lot from this day one of the webinar series. See you again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Philippine Standard Time, for our day two for that practice of knowledge management in the public sector. Only here on the PSP webinars. So again, thank you, Sir John, for joining, and see you again tomorrow. So thank you, Sir
Thank you,
Enzo.
Gerard. Thank you, Enzo.